Rome at the Luis Guido Carli University. So, as you all know, and as we discussed yesterday in great detail, the EU published its Global Europe Strategy in 2006. And two of the most important elements of that strategy were, first of all, a shift away from multilateralism to bilateral trade negotiations. And an important part of the strategy was also to sign preferential trade agreements with South Korea, India, and the members of ASEAN. First, they started negotiations with ASEAN as a whole, and then switched to signing bilateral agreements, or negotiating bilateral agreements with these countries. And we tried to understand why the EU started these negotiations, or at least one explanation. Because it's in a way puzzling if you look at standard international political economy explanations. They look at two types of firms usually. First of all, those that compete with imports, so those that would be hurt by a preferential trade agreement. And it's usually argued that this type of actors is most easily mobilized and most vocal, and therefore most influential. And as they would be against this kind of agreement, one would expect these agreements not to happen. Another type of actors that this kind of explanation looks at are exporters. So one could argue that exporters would be interested in exporting their products to these markets. However, with the exception probably of South Korea, it is the question how interesting these markets are for exporters, as they are, most of them are low-income countries. So that's why most explanations on signing of these agreements or the negotiations of these agreements look mainly at the preferences of EU policymakers. So one argument, for instance, is that the Commission has liberal preferences and therefore starts this kind of liberalization negotiations. Another explanation is the one that we discussed yesterday, and it's more realist type of explanations. So those are the two explanations you will find in the literature. And although we do not argue that those kind of explanations play no role, we say that if you really want to have a look at why these explanations or why these negotiations started, we should have a more serious look at the role of business interests. And our argument basically is that although import competing firms and exporters still play an important role in trade policy making, they are no longer the only relevant actors in trade policy. Given the internationalization of production, the increase of intra-industry trade, so two-way trade in the same product, as well as the emergence of global value chain, we see that a third type of actor has emerged, which we call import-dependent firms, and we argue that they have become increasingly important in trade policy. So import-dependent firms are those firms that rely on imports for an important part of their production process. This can be either firms that have outsourced their production and therefore re-import basically these products. It can be firms that import commodities or intermediate products which they will use in their production process, or it can be retailers that import their finished products from these countries in Asia. So these three types of firms, we argue, play a much more important and increasingly important role in EU trade policy making, and we should have a more serious look at their preferences and their influence on policy. So our argument basically says that they have a clear benefit from trade liberalization, as trade barriers in the EU will be lowered, so it's cheaper for them to import products from Asia. Second of all, they have a certainty to gain from this kind of agreements, as they are in a clear trade relationship with these countries. It's clear that if import barriers on these products from these specific countries will be lowered, they will gain from such an agreement. And thirdly, in a way it's similar, is that their collective action costs will be lowered as they have established their own interest groups in the last 10 to 15 years. And you see that many of the sectors in which they're operating have gone through a wave of consolidation, so there is less firms that need to be mobilized, which makes it easier for them to become politically active. So the bottom line is that because these actors become more important, within the economy in the EU, a stronger coalition of firms in favor of liberalization emerges, being exporters and import dependent. So the methods we use, we use a plausibility prop, meaning that we try to demonstrate the empirical relevance of our argument by looking at cases that we think would attract the attention of import-dependent firms. So we don't aim to give a definitive proof that the role of import-dependent firms was the sole and only reason why the EU started these negotiations, but we want to show that their role played an important role during the negotiations. So that is the main aim. We look at, basically we look at the universe of cases, meaning that we look at the negotiations with India, with South Korea, and from the ASEAN countries we selected Vietnam as our case study. So our empirical evidence is based on process tracing and congruence testing. So what we're looking at is, what were the stakes of these import-dependent firms? Did they have a clear interest in these type of preferential trade agreements? Did they mobilize? And thirdly, do we think they have influenced the negotiations, or have they been able to put issues on the negotiating table? Because as you know, the negotiations with Vietnam and India are still ongoing. The only ones that have been concluded is the one with South Korea. So in those two cases, we mainly look at the negotiating process and which issues have been on the negotiating table. So in the paper, we give 3 pieces of evidence for why we think they had an interest in this type of agreements. One of them is that if you look at the increase in imports of intermediate goods, so that is mainly important for those firms that use intermediate goods from these countries within their production process. We see here is this is Vietnam, this is South Korea, this is India, that there's a clear increase in imports of intermediate goods with all these countries. It's more than a doubling in case of India and South Korea, and a doubling in case of Vietnam. So meaning that, and it started before negotiations started and has been ongoing since. We also give evidence, although we're still playing around with this data, on vertical intra-industry trade, which is an indirect way to measure the type of trade that import-dependent firms are engaged in. As I said, we're still playing around with this data, so I'm not showing that here, but that's the second piece of evidence that we use in the paper. And then thirdly, we look at finished goods that are being imported from these countries, particularly the type of goods that retailers would be interested in. And we find that among the top finished goods imported from these countries are the typical goods that retailers would import. For instance, clothing, shoes, etc. So I think we do show in the paper that the type of goods and the increase of imports definitely shows that their interests were in line with signing this type of agreement. So then we look at political mobilization based on interviews, document studies, secondary sources. We find that the organizations representing import-dependent firms were actively involved in the discussions. They were lobbying the European Commission, member states. So we find definitely political mobilization on the side of typical import-dependent interest groups, which are Eurocommerce, the Foreign Trade Association, for instance, and the European Roundtable of Retailers. We also find that on the side of other types of business associations which have a more broad membership, including also exporters, for instance, such as Business Europe, the European Services Forum, and SAFIC, we see that they have also been arguing that besides opening those markets for export from Europe, they're also interested in lowering barriers in the EU for their members, in the sense that imports will be cheaper. So, besides the fact that they had a stake in these negotiations, we see political mobilization. And the third part of our findings, we look at whether or not they have been influential during negotiations. And we do that, first of all, by means of preference attainment. So we look at their demands and compare those to either the negotiation issues or the agreement itself in case of Korea. And we do find that there is a clear link between what they are demanding and what is on the negotiating. So that in a way shows that they have been able to influence negotiations. We've also, and of course this is not a waterproof way to show it, but we have asked them to self-assess their influence as well as do peer assessments. So we asked interest groups whether they themselves think they have been influential, whether other interest groups thought they were influential. We also asked our interviews on the policy side whether they thought import-dependent firms played a role in the negotiation process. And also there we find evidence that they have been an influential factor during the negotiations. So that brings me to to our conclusions. I think what we show with this paper, first of all, is that global value change and the increase of intra-industry trade changes the politics of trade, meaning that import-dependent firms play an increasingly important role in trade policy making, and that we should pay more attention to their role and influence in policy. We also see that because there seems to be a stronger coalition emerging consisting of exporters and import-dependent firms, that there is a stronger coalition in favor of trade liberalization, and there seems to be less domestic opposition against trade liberalization on the business side of it. And finally, we argue that our explanation is an alternative and underexplored explanation for the wave of new regionalism we have seen across the globe. So we argue it's not only possible to explain with our argument what happened in the European Union, but probably also in other regions. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. We're well within the time. You go ahead. We don't take questions. Okay. So, Elsa? Garnes Uba? Thank you. From LSE is going to explain to us what he's going to do in our PhD thesis, which was great. I'm looking forward to hearing more about what you're going to do. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. First, I would like to thank the organizers for accepting for me to present this early on. This is part of my first chapter of my dissertation that I've just concluded, so it's very early work, but so any feedback that you have will be really, really helpful. Overall, as you can see from the title, I'm trying to look at the role of ideas, in particular neoliberal ideas, and looking into differences within neoliberal ideas themselves, and then the role of the Director General for Trade in, I'd say, in accumulating and promoting those ideas within EU's trade policy. So how did this all come to be? The wider context within which I started thinking about the dissertation was the earlier work on the resilience of neoliberal ideas, especially during the global financial crisis and the economic crisis, and look into how DG Trade and other policy actors have promoted export-oriented interests and the idea of competitiveness, regardless of the expectations of protectionism. This links to an idea about this also links to this wider trade policy agenda that we spoke about yesterday, and the complexity of the international trade policy system, and how when the international trade system is no longer that much about tariffs, it goes to the heart of regulatory issues and different regulatory philosophies of member states. And then, on top of this, you have the Director General for Trade as the chief negotiator that has to consolidate these different regulatory philosophies and aims to promote them externally within multilateral and bilateral settings through different choice of venues that has been studied before as well. So within this context, I was wondering, first of all, how come the Director General for Trade manages to keep markets open, at the same time consolidates the different regulatory philosophies by the different member states, and at the same time keeps promoting them sometimes more successfully than other times. And questions that the research that I try to look at is how ideas are constructed, and in particular how neoliberal ideas are constructed, by looking into the difference within neoliberalism itself. So I try to explore how the interaction between the Director General for Trade and member states through the Trade Policy Committee shapes this normative consensus, how this is done, and what is the consensus that comes about. In order to do this, I think that one of the ways to highlight the ideational component is to look at how EU consensus is challenged from the outside. So when EU normative consensus is challenged, how this ideational dissonance is then consolidated back within the interaction between the trade and the TPC. So whether the normative debate is reopened again. Some of the some of the assumptions within my approach, as I said, I've tried to look into the role of ideas. So I do not dismiss other factors, and I don't try to look into a dichotomy between material and ideational factors, but I assume that ideas have a strong role in EU trade policy making, and that role is beyond just being material straitjackets. That it drives to an extent policy making when it comes to regulatory issues and non-tariff barriers. And then I hold the position that ideas are constituted; they are not just out there, and how they're constituted also matters how far they influence policies. What I mentioned earlier, I take an actor-centered approach, so I try to look at how precisely the Director General for Trade within the European Commission prioritizes certain neoliberal ideas to others with its interaction with different member states' ideologies, and how these ideas start to constitute its normative position then that is legitimized externally. As you can see from this side, it does. My initial idea was to try to look at all three steps. So how first normative consensus is created internally, then how it is promoted, and then when challenged, how this is taken back. So, but because this is quite extensive, I'm now focusing almost exclusively on how the interaction between DG Trade and the TPC shapes this normative consensus in the first place. And then since we speak about the wide trade policy agenda, it constitutes everything from government procurement through environment to social issues. So I've started to test how this could work, specifically focusing on the area of competition policy and competition aspects of competition issues within trade policy. So looking into the interaction between competition and trade. And the reason to do this is that I started looking into competition issues and how they have become more and more prolific, not only into bilateral enforcement agreements, but also in cooperation agreements, in PDAs, plurilateral agreements, and also on the multilateral level. So at the same time, the literature when it comes to competition and the link between competition and trade policy has mostly focused on legal and economic issues rather than looking from it from a political economic perspective. And mostly it does show a good example of these both changes and continuities when it comes to the neoliberal discourse and this move from embedded neoliberalism to neoliberal thinking. At the same time, it links with wider issues that I'm looking to explore that have been studied before on the discourse of globalization and how that conditions trade policy. When it comes to the link between trade and competition and how I'm going to proceed next, I first am going to look for neoliberal norms in competition and try to distinguish between competition-based, free trade competition-based policies versus industrial policy versus national champion-based approaches that I think at this stage from my preliminary research to an extent quite clearly link with different member states' ideologies and that again, have been looked at before. And then I want to move on to look at the starting positions of your member states, so underlying national norms on competition and how that links to trade in particular. And then I'll move on to discussion to EU competition policy.